A massive golden eagle floated high above the five kingdoms. It circled the grounds of the Temple of the Immortal Protectors. The sun was bright, and the blue sky was smeared by only a few clouds. The hidden temple is nestled between two peaks of a mountain range, almost directly in the center of the kingdoms. One of the peaks is an 11,000-foot volcano simply called the Mountain. The snow-capped summit can be seen from any place within the five kingdoms. The mountain looks as if it is hovering in the haze of the hot sunny day. From the eagle's view, we can see Toilet appear from one of the few paths in the forest leading to the temple. She stopped short just inside the yard and looked around. She glanced up as well, but did not see the eagle. The eagle is way too high and has much better vision than her. She moved quickly across the field and disappeared into the temple. The eagle took a dive and retreated into the forest to its favorite perch atop one of the massive trees surrounding the temple. Once inside the temple, Toilet went directly to the elevator and then to her fourth-floor living quarters. The inside of her apartment was very tidy and clean. The main room is a huge library with a large mahogany desk and comfortable black leather chairs. She seemed anxious. She froze inside the door when she saw the red light blinking on a console of lights and switches. She approached the console, hit a button to call up the hologram message, and Jeb appeared.
Heroes is missing. Anukit and I came here looking for him and received a message from one of the Outland posts looking for help. We aren't sure if the two are related, but went to investigate. Please have Nuit warn the others in case we need you. We will report back as soon as we know something.
Her face scrunched up with indecision, and she thought to herself.
The vision I saw while meditating was of pain and suffering. I don't have time to warn the other protectors.
And with that train of thought, she left her quarters and retrieved back to the main floor of the temple. She entered their meeting room and quickly rounded the table in the center of the room to a bank of lights and switches with screens on the wall next to a large set of steel double doors. She typed a few keys and read the print on one of the screens and nodded. She then typed some more and the doors opened. She stepped into a circular room, about 12 feet in diameter, with very tall shiny walls and no roof. The daylight peeked through the top of the vertical tunnel. The doors closed, and light started to flash. A bright white light, blended with the red-orange of her fire powers, swirled around her as she stood with her eyes closed waiting to be transported. The light lifted her out and through the roof, taking her to her destination. As she flew out past the roof of the temple in the beams of light, the eagle slipped into the stream behind her. Despite the intense heat from the neighboring desert, the caves were cold and wet. The eerie sound of dripping water was constant, as well as the smell of rotten meat. Heroes were suspended above the ground with invisible bonds. He struggled at first, trying to break them, but found it was of no use. He was going to have to wait this one out and hope an opportunity arose. Samesh was chained to the ground, the short chains kept his arms immobile. He laid on his side and barely spoke at all, just mumbled and groaned. They could see nothing and weren't alone in the dark room. The creature that subjugated heroes remained in this cavern and had been moving around in the murkiness. Every now and again, a slimy tentacle would brush their face, keeping them awake. Heroes closed his eyes and meditated. In an adjacent grotto, well lit and habitable, the red witch floated before a large stone basin. In the basin was a dark fluid, boiling and frothing. It spilled onto the floor. She waved her arms, and a large bubble formed and hovered in front of her. Inside the bubble, images of 3 individuals appeared. Jeb, Anukit and Moshe. She saw Jeb and Anukit leaving the boy behind, and knew they were on their way to her. Her fiendish laugh filled the caverns and she said to no one.
Like moths to a flame, I will finally have my revenge.
Jeb and Anukit moved fast and made it to the outpost by dark. They decided to set up camp on the outskirts of the small group of dwellings until the light of day. They could clearly hear the rowdiness of the crowd at the saloon, of which they were hoping to find answers. Answers were the only thing they wanted, not trouble. Anukit asked,
Have you heard of this witch we are looking for?
Jeb got the fire started and sat back.
Yes. I killed her father. I think she is trying to lure me there for revenge. That is why Moshe was left unharmed and allowed to leave. She is a tortured soul and has no qualms of killing innocents.
They both turned toward the sound of thunder, way off in the direction from which they just came. They stared for a moment and then settled back in. Anukit, still looking in that direction, said,
Wow. There must have been a reason for killing him. You are not the cold-blooded killer type. Care to share the story?
And Jeb says,
Why not? I have nothing to hide. He was a pernicious, vile creature who tortured his own offspring. I was here in the Outlands on patrol when it happened. There are 3 of them, by the way. Witches, I mean. He had 3 daughters, and he raised them with torment. I don't know if they are all still alive, as it was a very long time ago that this happened. Once it was over, they were orphaned. Both of their parents perished. I couldn't help but feel responsible. One of the villagers assured me she would take care of the 3 girls. I had no choice but to believe her. I couldn't bring them back to the kingdoms. I had to let fate handle it. I'm guessing now I should have brought them back to live at the temple. Maybe they would have had a better life.
Anukit said,
You don't know that. They may have had a good life here, but some people just cannot be helped. If what you said is true and you are no liar, then they were better off without the father.
She paused and stared at the fire, then said,
It is too bad their mother died too.
Jeb,
For sure. Do you ever think about the fact that we cannot help everyone? We have all of these powers, and yet we can only be in one place at a time.
She smiled and said, Unless you are ISIS. He laughed and nodded in agreement. After a moment of thought, Anukit said,
We are protectors, not saviors. Plus, the Aligwen never intended for us to protect those from the Outlands. They didn't know that they even survived and continued to exist. But honestly, our job would be boring if they didn't exist.
Jeb says.
True.
Morning arrived, and they set out. The sun beat them down as they approached the small outpost. There were just a few dwellings, some made of stone and others made of wood. Grayed and rotten with age. The saloon stood in the center of the western side on a hard-packed road traveling north and south. The other abodes stood on either side, and a few on the eastern side as well. Anukit and Jeb approached cautiously from the east, and stopped on the edge of the road, in the shadows of a hut, to survey the situation. The saloon was the largest construct, and made of stone. It doubled as an inn, and is the only 2-story building in the small group. Anukit made note of the old stone well just outside the establishment's front door. Muffled music danced on the air from the direction of the saloon, but the rowdiness they heard the night before was no longer present. Jeb asked,
Is the well enough? If we have trouble?
Anukit nodded.
There are large pockets all around us, but the well is sufficient.
Jeb says,
Very well. Are you ready?
Anukit twisted her head, and an audible pop filled the air around them, and she said,
Let's do this.
They stepped out of the bright hot sunlight into the muggy humidity of the tavern. The Twanji music stopped, and the man holding the instrument stared in shock at the newcomers, as did everyone there. A mixed crowd, about a dozen or so, most looked human. Jeb did note a few pointy ears. He was already on alert, but the Gilayim would complicate things if this got out of hand. And it usually did in the Outlands. They approached the bar. The man working set down the glass he was wiping and moved to meet them. He was old and weather-worn, grey stringy hair hung down, and met his equally stringy eyebrows. He had a round face and loose jowls, but his most remarkable attribute was his piercing yellow eyes. They almost glowed. Jeb pretended he didn't notice. Anukit wore her usual cool, unbothered look. The man stopped in front of them and grunted a greeting. Jeb nodded and asked,
"Can you tell us the way to the caves?"
The man responded with a low, gurgly voice.
"What business do you have there, Protector?"
Jeb said.
"None of yours."
The shopkeep's rebuttal.
Then why should I help?
Jeb knew this would be a dead end, but he had hoped anyway. He turned to leave, but Anukit grabbed his arm and spoke up.
"We are here to rescue Samesh of Polis. He was taken by the Red Witch and is in need. We can just deliver this message to you, in hopes that some of you brave folk will step up and rescue him, as I am sure he provides aid to this outpost when needed, being the leader of the closest town and all."
She looked around at the patrons, and most turned their gazes to their drinks and did not make eye contact.
"Or you can tell us where to go, and we can do what we can to help get him back to his family."
A long silence, and then from the dark corner a large man stood up and said mockingly,
"The immortal protectors."
His even bigger friend struggled to get out of his seat and joined him. Jeb turned and put the bartender to his back to face the potential threat. Anukit turned her head but did not turn away from the barkeep. The bartender came to his senses and said,
Now, Orin, Moragar, we don't want any trouble. We tell them what they need, and we won't see them again for another 100 years. Sit back down, and the next round is on the house."
He then turned to Anukit and said,
"The caves are over the pass of the Barren Mountains, just north of the town of Polis. Now, please go, and leave us to our business."
Jeb was locked in a stare-down with the one called Orin and said,
"So we have the pleasure to be in the company of the great Orin of the Flame and Beauregard the Kensei. It is nice to finally meet you. Amon Rock speaks highly of you."
Orin walked slowly toward them. He grimaced at the mention of Amun Ra and retorted,
"You won't think it is so nice when I'm finished with you, Protector."
Boyga reached out and grabbed Orin's shoulder and said,
"My prince, please, another day."
Orin shrugged his hand off and stepped up to Jeb. Although he was shorter than Jeb by about 5 inches, he was just as wide and just as intense. Jeb did not flinch at all and returned the intensity, his pure white eyes staring back. The other patrons started to leave, and the bartender pleaded,
"Please take this outside."
Orin smiled, and his mouth was filled with fangs that were not there before. He started to grow taller until he was looking down at Jeb. His face started to contort, and Anukit thought,
"Shapeshifter."
The patron stood just outside the saloon looking in. Unexpectedly, a loud boom was heard, causing everyone to run, when they realized the old stone wheel exploded. A large stream of brown well water flowed in and around Anukit. She twisted in the swell, and lofted around the two men. She swiped her hand, and cut the bar in half with a high-pressure jet of water. The bartender pulled out a large sword, and came after her. She cut the sword to pieces and, with less pressure, pushed him hard into the wall, and he fell to the floor in a heap. She turned to the others and yelled.
"Enough!"
Jeb was the only one, not looking at her in awe. His eyes were still locked on Orin. Orin was back to his human form, and Boyga was pulling him back to the booth they had previously occupied. The bartender spoke behind them from his place on the floor.
"Please leave. You have what you need."
They both nodded. Anukit released the water, and it splashed to the wooden floor. She put a handful of coins on the half of the bar still intact, then they departed. They stepped back out into the sunlight, and Jeb headed southwest. Anukit followed and said,
I thought he said north of Polis.
Jeb said,
Moshe sent us west and then southwest. The caves are over the pass, but it is the one south of the town of Polis, not north. He lied to us.
Anukit did not question him on that statement but said,
You almost lost your cool in there, and you knew them. Who were they?
He is a spoiled prince. Amun saved his father, Kamal's life a long time ago, and kept Oren from taking his father's crown. There was a treaty formed at that time. The king agreed to look after all in the Outlands, and to keep peace with the 5 kingdoms as long as we stayed out of their business. Oren holds a grudge, and isn't too much of a threat yet, while his father lives. The king is very old, and when he does die there will be a bridge to cross.
He then stopped and looked at Anukit with a raised eyebrow.
What? You were in that briefing, same as me, about the king of the Outlands. Why am I having to explain this?
That was like 200 years ago. I live for the moment, in case you haven't noticed.
Jeb rolled his eyes and said,
Oh. I've noticed.
She shrugged and moved past him. He stood there for a second, chuckled and continued after her. They walked for a few hours, the mountain range slowly filling out the horizon, a blurry dark gray through the rising heat. She stopped suddenly. Head down, eyes closed.
What is it?
Jeb asked.
Someone's coming.
How do you know?
I don't know, I just know. We can dive into the how later.
Jeb scanned the area and saw nothing but desert behind them, and the choppy hills in front of them. Then, through the heat waves coming off of the scorching sand, he saw movement. Someone riding a large animal slowly approached from the northwest. The drab, bleary backdrop of the mountains concealed the rider's advance. Jeb asked,
You good?
Yes, there is a large pocket of water directly under us.
The rider stopped 100 yards out and dismounted the animal, which looked to be a horse from this distance. It may have had more than 4 legs, but the heat waves made it impossible to verify. The animal stayed, and the rider slowly walked toward them. Hands out in plain view. This person was dressed like Moshe had been, common desert wear for the folks of the Outlands. At 20 feet, Jeb yelled out,
That's far enough. State your business.
The mysterious rider flipped the hood covering her face and said,
I am looking for my son, Moshe. Are you immortal protectors? You certainly do not look like you're from around these parts.
Jeb felt the ground tremble as Anukit let go of the water under their feet, and he let out the breath he was holding. He said,
Yes, I am Geb and this is Anukit. Your son summoned us and should be on his way home. We left him at the summoning stone, 2 days east and 3 hours north with enough food and water to make the trip.
Anukit said,
He should be about a day or 2 behind us.
Anya said,
Several of our riders went looking, and only one has returned. He says the Red Witch summoned demons from the desert and killed his crew, just like she did the night Heroes was taken.
Jeb asked,
Do you know the way to her cave?
Anya pointed to the mountain pass and said,
You will find a rocky trail at the foothill, and it will lead to the other side. You will pass the spot from which we called upon Heroes and his men. I regret to tell you we did not bury the dead.
She took her eyes off of them for the first time to look at the ground.
We did not have time.
Anukit approached her and took her hand.
We will do what we can for your husband.
Anya looked up at Anukit and said,
She is evil, and will try to stop you in that mountain pass. Please be ready for anything. Thank you for helping. I must move on to find my son.
They watched her disappear in the heat and turned toward the mountain pass to look for the trail. An hour later, they were standing at the edge of the camp where Heroes was taken and his men slaughtered. It was a gruesome sight, and the smell was atrocious. Buzzards had already been busy, and the bodies were unidentifiable. Anukit let a tear slip down her face and said, through gritted teeth,
What kind of animal does this?
One we are gonna have to face.
said Jeb, with a look of determination. They quickly buried the bodies and followed the strange tracks made by the witch's monster to a path that led up into the hills. Soon, the daylight turned to darkness, but they were not stopping this night. Jeb paused once in a while to survey the ground. Anukit never questioned his choices in direction, he was the best tracker on their team. The mountain pass was steep and tight in places, they had to turn sideways a few times to get through crevasses. No light led them, and a few times, Anukit was walking with her hand on Jeb's shoulder, trying not to trip on boulders in the path. During one of these times, she tugged, and he stopped. He whispered.
What is it?
She didn't answer right away and he waited, knowing she was concentrating. She whispered back.
The ground.
What?
The grue.
Before she could get out the word. Pale, milky white arms with too many joints, twisting in all directions, withered their way up and out of the ground around them, and wrapped themselves around their legs. Jeb lifted his right leg, and grabbed at the arm wrapped around it, and pulled. A small slimy creature with dead, opaque eyes, its pasty skin almost transparent, plucked from the loosened soil, and wrapped its other limbs around his face. Its mouth, a large crevasse with small, needle-like teeth, was snapping at Jeb. He danced with this creature, and was clawing at his face when he tripped over a large stone in the pathway, and disappeared out of Anukit's limited sight. She reached out for a water source, but they were too high in the hills. Nothing. Something mucky hit her hard from behind, and she slammed into the rock wall and went down hard. Stunned, she laid there while several creatures attached themselves to her body. Her armor proved to be too tough for their large sticky stingers protruding from within their throats. She was swinging her arms, keeping them away from her face. She yelled out.
Jeb.
He grunted a reply, and it seemed he was far away. Then a bright purple hue exploded through the darkness of the pathway, and revealed the creatures covering the rock walls and in the path around them, squirming this way and that. They looked like wet grey balls with several arms, with human-looking hands, about 3 feet in diameter, face and body as one. The light source came from Jeb. He tapped into his powers and created a large kinetic sword. He swung it across the chasm, cutting the beasts in pieces. He cleared the ones trying to get at Anukit, and stood over her swinging his great sword, slicing the creatures as they flung themselves at the two immortal protectors. She felt helpless. Soon, there were too many, and they started coming at them from all sides, clambering down the narrow walls of the path. He helped her to her feet, and they ran forward, and over the mountaintop, he kept the sword up to lighten their path. The Red Witch wailed hotly at the bubble before her, showing Jeb and Anukit running away with the lit sword in his hand. She screamed to no one.
You will die.
Jeb continued to swipe at the little beasts, hurling themselves at them, cutting them clean, and each would turn to a slimy goo as it was killed, and return to whatever hell it came from.
These are called for.
What?
They are convoked.
He said breathy. His breath came in rasps, from running down the mountainside.
Still not following.
Anukit's speech was normal, almost like she was bored.
It's a malignant beast, called forth from elsewhere. Nothing like anything we have ever faced before. If we make it out of here alive, we will need to have a discussion with all 10 immortal protectors on how to handle this in the future.
Keywords: being. Make it out of here alive.
She said, and he didn't need to see her face to know she was smiling. She was enjoying this.
You are one strange being.
He said as he backstepped and swiped his great purple sword from side to side. Soon the rampage stopped. Tired and angry, they moved on down the hillside. The sun was coming up, and the mountain ridge they just came over silhouetted the sky behind them. An hour or so into their descent, she stopped again and stood quietly with her eyes closed. Jeb must have felt the tension and turned to eye her, but was immediately distracted at the sky above her. He jumped past her and raised the lighted purple sword over his head as a gigantic rock, the size of a train, struck and split in two to miss them both by mere inches. He dove and tackled her to one side behind a large boulder, in the crooked path they followed. As they hit the ground, another large rock struck the boulder from the other side, spraying broken bits above and around them. Another one hit and another. Someone or something was throwing them from above. He looked at her, smiled, and said,
Not a good time to be taking a nap.
I sensed it. Somehow, I sensed it.
You almost felt it. We need to figure something out quickly.
Another boulder smashed to pieces around them, spraying them with smaller broken rocks. She looked out at the land laid out before them, at the bottom of the mountain, and saw trees in the distance. She said,
I feel humidity.
In that instant, Jeb felt the air around him heat up, as he watched water droplets form on her skin. Before long, he cooled again, and she had an exoskeleton of water armor shimmering around her body. Childlike amazement permeated his face. Confidence replaced her boredom, and she said,
Let's do this.
They stepped out into the path, and were pummeled by boulders. They had no idea of the numbers waiting. The dead army raised by the red, which was in the hundreds, they crawled all over the now visible, sunny, mountainside. Demons of all shapes and sizes. The larger of the beasts were throwing boulders, over and over, down on Jeb and Anukit. Soon they were buried in rubble and all was quiet. Toret landed with one knee down and eyes closed. Still not seeing the great eagle exit high above. When she opened her eyes, she had to blink back tears from the bright sunlight. Slowly focusing on her surroundings, she noticed a young boy staring at her in disbelief. She stood up and looked around. She didn't recognize the area where she was transported, but knew it to be the outlands in the southwest because of the great desert before her. The boy sat in the shade and was eating a meal. He said,
Hi.
Hello. How are you?
Much better, thank you. Are you here to help?
Help? Can you tell me what kind of help you need?
Moshe quickly recapped his story and told her of Huros, and then Jeb and Anukit. The growing anxiety within her swelled with every word of his story. By the time he was finished, she was perplexed. Not sure if she should go back and get help or just go find them. A rider came out of the heat waves and startled them both. It was Moshe's mother. She took him in her arms and cried.
I thought I lost you.
I had to get help. 2 immortal protectors answered my call, Geb and Anuket. They went to help Father. And this is Taret.
Moshe swept his arm toward Toret. Toret said,
Pleased to meet you. Can you tell me anything? Where they might have been heading? Your son mentioned the caves. Do you know where they might be?
Anya said,
Met your friends in the desert 2 days ago. They were almost to the mountain pass that would lead them to the caves.
Anya pointed out the direction.
The Red Witch will try to stop you. She has killed many from our village lately. Use caution if you are to go to them.
Toret made them both jump in surprise when she twitched a little and her entire body was covered in a bright red flame. she said through gritted teeth.
Let her try.
In her transformed state, she could see through the desert heat waves clearly. Miles off, there were black clouds swirling around one of the many mountain peaks of the barren mountains. They were the only clouds in the sky. She blasted off in the direction of the pass at a blinding speed, leaving a trail of red flame and a wake of torched glass in the desert sand.